What up, gamers? Fencer here, and welcome back to my reaction to the SpongeBob conspiracy compilation with 8 new theories. Last time we watched the television theory and the skeleton mini theory. In this video, it's going to be full on Mrs. Puff theory with even like a part 2 for the mini theory. So, yeah, let's go and watch it, guys. Let's see how this goes.
This is not Mrs. Puff. You may think she's just SpongeBob's boating teacher, but you'd be very, very wrong.
What a way to start.
She's been running from her dark and mysterious past, but it's finally caught up to her. And behind it all is a mastermind who's been secretly controlling her life and psychologically torturing
Another obvious foreshadowing.
her.
Didn't read that in
If you
time.
guys thought my last 2 theories were mind-blowing, get ready for my biggest conspiracy yet. This is the Mrs. Puff theory.
Yeah, for me, it was the
Now,
television
a lot
theory.
of people have been asking,
That feels big.
Alex, how do you come up with these crazy conspiracy theories? Well, I always
That's funny. I mean, like, if you take in the whole don't feed the muse stuff, then you'll understand what this is about. I do wonder, so I'm guessing he'll cut out all the stuff with the muse. Because, yeah, at the end, that does show up, but, since he's pretty much done with that, he doesn't really need to show it.
start these theories by looking for the moments in the show that seem to be implying more than they're letting on. Like I've said before, SpongeBob is a weird show with lots of abstract humor, but I can usually understand the intent the writers had behind a weird joke. But then there's stuff like this.
Yeah, this scene was so weird.
Hope I still remember how to do this.
Something you want to see. Something weird to see back in the day.
Yeah.
And it's so confusing and weird that it feels like the writers are trying to imply something beyond just weirdness for the sake of comedy. And nowhere in the show is there more of these moments than with Mrs. Puff. And once I started looking into it, it led me down the deepest rabbit hole I've ever seen from this show. So, let's begin.
Part 1. Mrs. Puff's Dark Past.
Mrs. Puff is a boating school teacher in Bikini Bottom. She's passed all of her students except for one, SpongeBob SquarePants. He's taken her driver's test hundreds of times and he always ends up failing it and causing destruction and chaos that usually ends up with Mrs. Puff going to jail, despite it not really being her fault. We also know that she was once married, but her husband was killed by fishermen.
That's my driving teacher, Mrs. Puff.
Mrs. Puff? Oh, she's married.
Oh no, Mr. Krabs, she's single.
Then what happened to Mr. Puff?
There he is.
She doesn't like to talk about it.
Throughout the show, there are moments like this that seem to be hinting at her having a dark, mysterious past. And in Season 2, Episode 10, No Free Rides, we get the biggest clue about who Mrs. Puff really is. After SpongeBob fails the driving test yet again, Mrs. Puff has just had it with him and ends up just giving up and giving him his license even though he never really passed. She quickly realizes that this is a horrible idea and he'll probably end up destroying the entire town.
Yeah, that'll be a day
This reporter asks
when he does get a
why.
license.
Local consensus places the blame on this
That'd be like an
negligent,
event.
selfish driving instructor who
Remember this clip, because it's going to be very important later on. And then she
Yes.
says this insanely revealing line.
What have I done? Everyone will know that I let him slide through school. I'll have to move to a new city, start a new boating school with a new name. No, not again.
Not again. Yeah, that part really, like, yeah, you definitely know there's something there. That there's some kind of like something hidden within Mrs. Puff after that line.
No, not again. Come on, it's like they're just begging someone to make a theory about this. So we now know Mrs. Puff was originally from a different town, she used to own a different boating school, and Mrs. Puff isn't even her real name. There's something in her past that she ran away from. Now, there's been some debate over whether she's actually referring to a new name for herself or for her boating school, but I do think she's talking about her own name. Because if she's trying to run away from something in her past, she wouldn't start a new boating school with her real name in the title. Now, when she says again, I don't think she's just referring to starting a new life.
Everyone will know that I let him slide through school. Not again.
Yeah, that was included.
I think at her previous boating school, she had a terrible student just like SpongeBob who she prematurely gave a license to, and it led to something so terrible happening that she had to run away and start a whole new life. In Season 3, Episode
Imagine we get
5,
an episode
Doing
of that
Time,
one-
we
one
get
day.
a flashback to when she first opened up the school.
Where did I go wrong? With the opening of my new boating school, I pledge that as long as a student is willing to learn, I shall never give up.
Hi, I'm SpongeBob SquarePants.
With the opening of this new boating school. Let's keep in mind that this is not her first boating school. Maybe the whole reason she's making this pledge now at her second school is because she gave up on a student at her previous school, and that led to her having to run away and start a new life. She's pledging to never make the same mistake again. Now let's skip ahead to one of the newer episodes. Season 12, episode 21, Lighthouse Louie, where Mrs. Puff has SpongeBob organize all the stuff.
Yeah, this was
in the school's
interesting
lighthouse.
because I think there was so
There's
many
lots of
Easter eggs in
interesting
this
things
one
hidden in the background, but the
episode.
first thing that caught my eye was this file labeled.
Yeah, lots of people commented on Mr. Krabs' photo. They've been low-key dating for most of the series. No, yeah, that was like there's like a lot of like Easter eggs, I would say, in this episode.
Is Puff. It makes sense for a teacher to have files on all their students, but why would she have a file about herself? But let's remember, she's not Mrs. Puff. That's a fake identity she created, and I'm willing to bet all of her fake identification documents are in this file. Hey, Alex from the future here. This is actually the file from Mrs. Puff You're Fired that shows all the time she's failed to pass SpongeBob. But let's be honest, this was the least impressive evidence in this lighthouse, so I think it's fine. But that's not the only hint about Mrs. Puff's past in this lighthouse. There is something in here that directly confirms all of this. As SpongeBob swallows all of Mrs. Puff's junk, we see something very interesting for only a few frames. Deranged boat.
Yeah, this
makes
one.
Getaway. 10 seasons later, and
Man.
the creators are still hiding stuff about Mrs. Puff fleeing her old life. It might not look like it.
Yeah, this one. Deranged boat teacher makes getaway. Distracts authorities with balloon animals, which we did see earlier. And this is from the New Kelp Post, October 21st. Oh, that's very much close by. Like right now, from when this video is going up.
First, but we actually get a ton of new information from this newspaper. This is from the New Kelp Post, which tells us Mrs. Puff originally lived in New Kelp City. Then there's a caption that reads, distracts authorities with balloon animals. And do you remember that clip from the beginning?
I hope
Yeah.
I still remember how to do this. Yeah.
So whenever Mrs. Puff makes a getaway or commits a crime, she leaves behind a balloon animal to distract the police. I'm telling you guys, these writers don't just do stuff randomly. They have reasons for everything. Okay, so...
I mean, maybe. The thing is, I think that episode, right, that Lighthouse Louie, because I think that was supposed to be like a whole Easter egg episode with all the stuff inside the lighthouse. It could be that they just decided to expand upon it, like just make a reference at least.
Before we move on, let me talk about this newspaper. This was by far the most direct, unambiguous piece of evidence
Yeah.
the show has ever given us for a theory, and I have never found anything else like it in the entire show. It's the
Oh, my bad. Oh yeah, I do think this is probably the strongest evidence that he does have though. Even though like a part of me does feel like, they just want to make more references because I think a lot of stuff in Lighthouse Louie was just references. And that's from my memory. I could be wrong on this, but I thought I saw like a lot more references with like the junk inside the lighthouse. um but yeah, I do think this one really does add so much new lore. Like if it's just more than just referring to something in the past, like an Easter egg.
white whale of SpongeBob theory evidence. But would you believe me if I told you that this newspaper actually has more hidden information inside of it that I missed?
Really?
If we look at the storyboard for this episode, we can see the newspaper originally had even more information about Mrs. Puff. Obviously, the
Bobby
big one,
Blowfish.
we now finally know Mrs. Puff's real name.
Oh, snap.
Bobby Blowfish.
And did you see that too? Like it said February 1997. I forgot if that's like I think that's when the show was first made, was it? I forgot. But that's also, just keeping in mind of dates too.
Originally, we only had the date the
Yeah.
newspaper was published, but now we have the year. This is
Wow,
the same
that's different. It's not October. It's now February 1997.
same year that the SpongeBob pilot came out, and
Oh,
finally,
okay, I
we
see,
now
yeah.
know how
It is when the show first came out. It's like what I said, nice.
Mrs. Puff escaped the cops chasing her. In the bottom picture, we see her heading towards a cliff with a sign that says Rock Bottom, a place that only the
Oh.
most skilled drivers could navigate. How is there still so much hidden lore in this newspaper? And
Wow.
the most damning piece of evidence from this newspaper
Dude,
is
that's-
actually the
That one really that's really crazy to think about, man. Just that that storyboard. Wow.
picture of Mrs. Puff. Kind of a strange photo, right? We have seen this exact same photo of her before. In the episode No Free Rides, when she imagines what would happen if SpongeBob got his license.
Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor.
Oh, it's the mug shot! Holy fuck, bro! This isn't a conspiracy! This is real!
I like seeing these
This means that
reactions,
this
man.
isn't just her imagination of what might happen. This is also her remembering what happened when she lived in New Kelp City and prematurely.
Like, I know
gave
I'm not going to be a
students
part of
license.
that.
And I'm willing to bet
'Cause, you know,
that
I'm-
the fish
I'm
reported in
recording
the
this, like,
news is
very
the
late
exact
into
same
the
one
whole
who reported about her in New Kelp City.
theory
Let me
videos.
explain. We know from the episode.
But like maybe
whatever
one day
happened-
I will be featured in his new set of theories if he ever does make one. That'll be cool to see.
happened to SpongeBob, that reporters from the Bikini Bottom News can also work for the New Kelp City News.
But that is if he
the
does
real
notice
reason
me.
I think this is because of his hair.
Notice me, senpai.
In the entire show, we have never seen this fish reporter with hair before. Why would the creators go out of their way to add that detail? Because Mrs. Puff isn't imagining him as he looks now. She's remembering him from years ago when he used to have hair, when he reported about her in New Kelp City.
But how does he have hair if he's
Oh.
a robot? All right, listen, when you make 8 crazy different theories, sometimes they're not all gonna perfectly line up, okay? What
There's
are you
gonna be
do?
some
Mrs. Puff
contradictions.
has been running from her past ever since. and
I'm
is
sure
now
like with the theories, you know, maybe consistency isn't is gonna be hard to do. But he did say that he did try his best with the television theory at least to make it all sense. Because yeah, I do think that's probably the theory that is true the most compared to the other ones.
forced to relive her experience with an unteachable student through SpongeBob, but reliving this trauma has pushed her to the point of complete insanity. And trust me when I say that you have no idea how delusional she actually is.
The insanity of Mrs. Puff.
Another running gag throughout the series is Mrs. Puff's occasional nervous breakdowns or moments of insanity because of SpongeBob, and they get more severe as the show continues. At first, she did care for SpongeBob, but in the newer episodes, she literally tries to kill SpongeBob just to get him out of her life. Even
Oh yeah, she's
SpongeBob
getting
just
more
walking up to
crazier
her
every
gives her severe
season.
PTSD.
Hi, Mrs. Puff.
Hit the brakes! SpongeBob! What?
I love this moment.
Wait, Mrs. Puff. We're not driving.
But these mostly seem
That's
like
just how bad he
one-off
is.
moments, and for the most part, Mrs. Puff is still a functioning member of society, right? I'm going to show you that she's actually much more insane and delusional than you may think. And some of the episodes she's in take place entirely in her own head. If we're talking about how insane Mrs. Puff is, there is no better place to start than the episode Doing Time. Once again, SpongeBob fails the boating test and causes destruction and chaos, which leads to Mrs. Puff going to jail. SpongeBob keeps breaking into jail to try and bust her out, but Mrs. Puff actually prefers being in jail over teaching him. We actually get another interesting line about Mrs. Puff's past in this episode.
Okay, you can do this, Puff. You can get through this without losing your sanity. Oh, that's a road we don't want to go down again.
So we know
Again.
that Mrs. Puff has lost her sanity in the past, probably from her previous terrible student. But it seems like she's recovered since then, except in this episode she has a complete mental breakdown. SpongeBob keeps appearing in impossible places until she gets thrown into solitary confinement, where each wall of the room transforms into a giant SpongeBob face. And then the episode ends.
Yeah, I do wonder if SpongeBob, like with her trauma and stuff, if that's even worse than the first students. I do wonder that.
In a way that's so weird and confusing that it rivals the infamous gorilla episode ending. As Mrs. Puff freaks out, she's suddenly transported back into the beginning of the episode when SpongeBob was taking the test. Except this time, SpongeBob gets arrested instead of her.
Help! Help! No! This is not a good time. No!
I can't believe it. It was all a dream. I'm not going to jail.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time.
In jail again. She's hallucinating.
Forget it.
So what's really going on in this episode? Was the ending all in her head? Is Mrs. Puff just caught in an endless loop? I think this
Nah,
entire episode is inside of Mrs. Puff's head, and she's actually on the
Yeah,
outside the whole
it's all in her
time,
head.
but she's been imagining herself inside of prison. I can explain. Listen closely to what the police officer tells Mrs. Puff.
I'm not going to jail.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time. And then revealing she's still in a prison uniform despite being on the outside. So this scene is obviously inside of her head, which means everything we see is symbolic. And if we can understand the symbolism of it, we can understand what's really going on with Mrs. Puff. Notice how she's
Yeah, you know, I kind of forgot. I just realized this with the imagination theory that with Mrs. Puff here, her imagination is so wild in this episode that she's able to conjure all this up. And I'm sure just because of like, her stressing out about SpongeBob that it kind of made her imaginative that this is all like happening, that this can all be recorded and stuff.
Suddenly wearing a black and white striped prison uniform, even though the entire episode she's been wearing this orange jumpsuit. Why would the creators go to the extra effort to draw a whole new prison uniform for her? Well, we've seen her wear this black and white prison uniform before, the very first time she went to prison back in Season 1, Episode 7, Hall Monitor. So when the police officer says, "You've already done your time," he's referring to the first time she went to jail. But why is she still
It could be. I don't know. It's just, just me being kind of nitpicky. The colors are a bit different. Like before, it was just blue, but at the same time, it could be just, they don't care much about consistency in general. But they have the same pattern at least.
wearing that uniform outside of prison? Well, she may have gotten out of jail, but she was by no means free. Having to teach SpongeBob is a prison in itself, and she manifests that by believing she's in jail and wearing a prison uniform despite being on the outside. This entire episode, every time SpongeBob magically appears, is all inside of her head. She is completely delusional, and hints that she's experiencing these hallucinations don't stop there. Just 6 episodes later, she goes to a house party
Oh yeah,
SpongeBob throws, and while
this
everyone is
this part was
talking
weird.
and having a good time, in the background we see she's literally sitting by herself
Yeah, what?
talking to an ice sculpture of SpongeBob. You can't tell me this isn't intentional. I
It's
mean,
so
look
funny.
at this. By herself.
It's like so stupid of her.
No fucking way! You're lying. You're lying. You're lying. That is insane. That is actually insane.
Now back in the episode No Free Rides, there is a very strange picture inside of Mrs. Puff's home. It's a picture of Mrs. Puff inside of a picture of Mrs. Puff
Yeah.
inside of a picture of Mrs. Puff, creating an infinite loop. This is something that has confused SpongeBob fans for years. But like
I remember I
everything
saw that back in the day too, but I never thought much about it, like what it meant. I just thought it was like just something funny to see, like, oh look, there's a picture of Mrs. Puff's house. Yeah, Mrs. Puff's house on a painting, like this scene.
in the show, there is a reason for it being there. One of the SpongeBob storyboard artists actually called it the biggest mystery in the entire show. If you think about it, this is just like the end of Doing Time, where she's stuck in an infinite loop of SpongeBob failing the driving test. Because it's all symbolic of what her life is, just an endless cycle of SpongeBob taking the test and failing, and no matter what she does to try and escape, she always ends up back in the same place at the end of the episode. So this picture is another symbolic manifestation of what she's feeling. We even
Yeah,
see another one
I can
of
see
these
that.
pictures all the way in Season 9, Episode 5, Bumper to Bumper.
And hey, we got another one in season 13, Potato Puff.
This is something
Wow.
that the show is consistently
Okay,
alluding to.
that's cool.
Mrs. Puff is an unreliable narrator, and anything we see with her can
They're, like,
potentially
continuing
all be inside of her own head. In
that
fact,
Easter egg.
I believe I found another episode that takes place inside of her head. In Season 9, Episode 17, SpongeBob Long Pants, SpongeBob goes to a different boating instructor and actually gets his license. But as soon as he does, we briefly cut to Mrs. Puff waking up.
You pass.
I finally got my driver's license!
Lock your doors, bar your windows, it's the end of the world!
Now, this seems like it's probably just a throwaway gag where Mrs. Puff somehow senses that SpongeBob got his license, and it causes her to wake up and freak out. You know, it's a good bit, it's funny, but I have a question. If the joke is that she's supposed to be waking up at the exact time SpongeBob gets his license, how come she wakes up at night when
Yeah.
SpongeBob clearly gets his license during the day?
It's all in her
Because
head.
This entire episode actually takes place inside of Mrs. Puff's head, and this is the only part of the episode in the real world.
I don't know what that was all about, but I'm glad it's over.
Originally, I paused the theory here to explain how we're able to see her hallucinations, even though I claim the show's supposed to be a nature documentary in my television.
No, yeah, I think this is all solved by the imagination theory, you know? Because, yeah, with Mrs. Puff, unlike Squidward, again, Mrs. Puff is like so stressed out about SpongeBob, she gets like PTSD, like just reacts immediately. So I'm sure with her, especially after that one episode, what's it called, Doing Time, of her like looping back and forth within the episode. Like, yeah, I'm sure like her imagination was so wild that her dream can also be recorded and viewed.
television theory. But if everything's supposed to be from a camera, then how are we seeing things from inside Mrs. Puff's head? In fact, how do we see dreams and flashbacks and thought bubbles? But I already explained that in my new imagination movie
Yeah.
theory, so definitely check that one out if
You
you
know,
missed it.
yeah, the more that I think about it, the more that I just feel like this theory is so plausible. Like for me, I'm not sure about the whole, dream predicting part, but I think the mechanics behind imagination itself, I feel like is good. Like I think it holds up well, even like right now.
It adds a
Like it's not just a cartoon. It's like it can all be explained other than, it's just a cartoon.
whole new layer to why Mrs. Puff is hallucinating so much. Back to the theory, we know that her insanity has caused her to live a life of delusion, but if you remember back to the Lighthouse episode, she's also become an extreme hoarder, and looking at her collection of junk is like a look directly into her mind, so there's gotta be something we can learn about her from it. There's a picture of her boyfriend, Mr. Krabs, the hall monitor belt she gives her students, the mean drawings her students make her, SpongeBob's diary, a boating safety helmet. Wait,
Yeah, see, like
SpongeBob's
there's so
diary?
many like different references this Lighthouse Louie episode.
Why does she have SpongeBob's diary? The last time we saw that, it was safely put away in SpongeBob's library. What's it doing in her lighthouse? And why does she have Squidward's painting? And a
Bold and
table for the
brash.
Krusty Krab? And SpongeBob's bike? And
Or like
Squidward's
belongs in
teddy
the
bear?
trash.
And the hair curlers Mr. Krabs had? Okay, so technically those were originally Mrs. Puff's hair curlers,
Even Mrs. Puff's hair curlers?
That one was a gift.
but it's implied that Mr. Krabs stole them from her, so her having
Wow.
them now probably means she stole them back. It still works for the point I'm trying to make. And that
I
statue
guess
of
so.
Squidward, and that diamond ring, and that crown, and that bucket of radioactive waste, and that jellyfish sign? Oh my god. Mrs. Puff is a kleptomaniac. Mrs. Puff has been stealing from everyone in Bikini Bottom. I can even prove that her pet snail from season 3 episode 19 was stolen.
My snail is up a tree.
Yeah, that's,
I've had her since
Squidward
I
snail.
was a little
During that race episode, right?
girl.
You've had that snail since you've been a little girl, huh? Then how come that is the exact same snail Squidward had 4 episodes ago in the Great Snail Race?
I wouldn't let Snally here play with that mongrel mutt. She's a purebred. See, she even has her own papers.
He even has her paperwork. Mrs. Puff clearly stole the snail from Squidward. But why the hell would Mrs. Puff steal all this other junk? What possible use could she have for any of it? We could find the answer to that question by looking at this green hat and this purple jacket. These were gifts Mr. Krabs bought her on their first date, but she ended up feeling uncomfortable receiving them and gave them back to him.
I'm afraid I
Yeah, she'll just steal
don't
anything.
feel comfortable accepting all these gifts.
Except apparently she's not too uncomfortable to steal them back afterwards. So clearly Mrs. Puff isn't stealing this stuff because she wants to use it. She just steals for the thrill of it. Maybe stealing things is her way of coping with the insanity of her everyday life. And remember, this isn't the first time she's gone insane.
You can get through this without losing your sanity. Oh, that's a road we don't want to go down again.
In fact, I have reason to believe that she started stealing things way back whenever she first went insane.
I hope I still
Yeah.
remember how to do this.
I don't think she's just
The whole
talking
criminal
about
part,
remembering how to make balloon
can see it.
animals. She's probably also referring to remembering how to steal a boat. And if that's not enough for you, in a SpongeBob comic book, she actually admits that she used to rob banks, and she wears the exact same ski mask.
Oh my
Ooh,
gosh.
And we can see the ski mask in the newspaper storyboard. That's cool.
Oh.
Mrs. Puff lives a completely delusional and miserable life, all because she has to teach SpongeBob how to drive. It's led her to steal from the people she cares about and completely disassociate from reality. But that begs a very important question. If SpongeBob is causing her life to be so miserable, then why does she even keep teaching him? After all the destruction...
Yeah, so after I think at this point is when I felt like it wasn't that strong. I do think everything else said so far was really good for the theory. Like some really good evidence. Like I believe pretty much a lot of it. But this next part I am a bit iffy on. It does feel like more of like just trying to connect the dots. But yeah, we'll see if it's like bad as I remember it to be.
and in pain he's caused, she'd totally be justified to expel him, right? I mean, she will literally try and kill him so she doesn't have to teach him, but for some reason...
To be fair, she was pushed to a breaking point this episode. She usually doesn't want to harm him. Yeah.
just expel him. It's almost
remember
like
that
there's
episode.
someone forcing her to teach SpongeBob.
Part 3, the mastermind.
Let's get
Oh,
real.
Ed. All right, let's resume. The mastermind.
Back to the episode No Free Rides, after prematurely giving SpongeBob a license, she steals his boatmobile so he can't hurt anyone. In the end, this causes her to get arrested and go to jail, but then SpongeBob tells her this.
And besides, the warden says she'll let you go early if you do her a favor.
What's that?
Free driving lessons!
She'll get to leave prison
Free.
early if she gives free driving lessons. That seems like an oddly specific requirement. And that's
Yeah.
not the only time this gets mentioned either. In Season 9, Episode 5, Bumper to Bumper, we get this scene.
If only
The
SpongeBob
picture.
could pass his boating test, he'd be out of my life once and for all. Unfortunately, I keep getting reminded of the consequences if I get too angry with the little nuisance.
Consequences. Are you telling me that if she refuses to teach SpongeBob specifically, she'll be violating
my
her
dog wants to
paroles
go
and
in.
get sent back to jail? Why does the prison even care if Mrs. Puff teaches SpongeBob? Is it just part of some weird community service? But things start to get really suspicious at the end of Season 7, Episode 5, Summer Job. Once again, Mrs. Puff ends up in jail, but this time she's forced to go to a prison boating school.
Oh, wow! A driver's education class!
Good day,
Dog wants to go out again.
class.
I must be having a nightmare! What's he doing here? Ugh.
Dear Mrs. Puff, I'm following in your footsteps and got a job as a driver's ed teacher for the summer.
Who in their right mind would hire SpongeBob to do this after he's literally destroyed
Yeah, these are
the
very
city countless
specific.
times while driving? Is this just another one of Mrs. Puff's delusions? Or is the prison intentionally forcing her to be around SpongeBob just to torture her? I mean, look at the way the guard forces her to sit there and listen to him.
Get me out of here! Oh, 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 ow! Oh, oh.
And look at that evil smile he has
That
as he
smile.
watches her endure this torture. There is something very strange going on with this prison. Then, in Season 10,
It does feel on
Episode 8,
purpose.
The Getaway, Mrs. Puff meets a criminal named Dorsal Dan and starts to get romantic feelings for him. This is also while she's still dating Mr. Krabs. Shame on you, Mrs. Puff. At the end of the episode, they both accidentally land in prison, and the warden puts him in solitary confinement.
Warden, I found this one pulling
Yeah, there's
up
the
outside
warden.
the prison. Dorsal Dan, a notorious getaway driver. Toss him
And yeah,
the
we've seen him
plate.
before too. He's about to mention it.
I'll wait for you,
That warden.
my little tenderfoot.
She says tenderfoot here, by the way, because he was really good at driving. A lot of people thought she said something else.
In or
Yeah,
out of
it
jail,
did
this
sound like
prisoner
that.
Stop at nothing to make sure she is
When I just heard it
alone
right
and
now.
Miserable. But why? Who's behind all of this? Why would anyone care this much about torturing Mrs. Puff? Who's the mastermind pulling the strings? Well, maybe it has something to do with her old life in New Kelp City. Maybe she crossed someone and they've been plotting their revenge ever since. But I've looked in every
Yeah, this
single
part I'm not
frame
sure
of New
about.
Kelp City,
Like,
and
I think
there
starting
is
from
nothing
this part.
connecting it back to the prison. I've looked literally everywhere, and there's not a single person from the city that has anything to do with Mrs. Puff. Well, I mean, maybe except for the literal warden of the prison she's being.
Yeah, so this part, I wasn't really believing. I mean, because this guy is like, he's got the tall model. This guy's got the short model. Like, yeah, it's got the same similar clothing. But yeah, I just don't think they're the same people. They look very different. And also, I'm not sure if like this part here, I'm guessing that's how far it can go for the frame. Like, yeah, it's been maybe cut out. But yeah, I just don't think I don't think it's him. It's just very different. They look very, very different. Just because this guy's like really tall and this guy's really short. And also my dog wants to go in.
Captain! He may be hiding slightly off screen, but that is clearly the same warden of the Bikini Bottom prison. And this
Yeah,
isn't
same
some
clothes,
random
but-
background character that the show reuses all the time. He is a very distinct character. You can call me out on the Squilliam video all you want, but not this time.
Now this one,
I've got some new thoughts.
yeah, this one I really don't believe. It's just he's drawn like way taller here, like I said.
On this mastermind warden theory, but I'll save them for the next mini theory.
Wait a
Ooh,
second,
okay.
wait a second.
Maybe it's not going to be as bad as I thought, because if he addresses that, or like, just try to enforces it better, then I guess I'll like it a lot more. Yeah, I think starting from that part, I just wasn't really believing that much. Because, yeah, I am kind of like nitpicky like that. Just like with the whole Squilliam robe thing. Like, I don't feel like that's the robe. Like, unless they're not really good with consistency on drawing his robe. But yeah, I just don't feel like I don't feel like it's him. Like I said, he's drawn very specifically. Like, he's a very specific character, yet he's like tall in the city in New Kelp City.
If the warden was originally from New Kelp City, then he'd probably know about Mrs. Puff's dark past and her true identity. So, why hasn't he exposed her? He's just kept quiet about the fact that one of his inmates is living a completely false identity. She'd probably even get more prison time when they find out who she really is, so why hasn't he said anything? This is where things get very interesting. So, we know Mrs. Puff prematurely gave a student at her original boating school a license, and that led to them causing chaos and destruction. Maybe this student accidentally did something terrible to the warden, and he's blamed Mrs. Puff ever since. Whatever happened was so terrible that it caused him to move to Bikini Bottom and get a job as the warden of the town's prison. And to his surprise, he finds out that one of his inmates is actually the person he blamed for that terrible thing happening. This works out perfectly for him. He can finally get
I don't
his
know,
revenge
man.
on Mrs. Puff
This one
by
feels like a
making her
stretch to
life
me.
miserable. All he has to do is reveal her dark secret, and she'll be stuck in jail for much longer. Except for one small issue with his plan.
Like I can see like the warden maybe, or like the jail itself, like the people within it. Maybe they have some kind of like, I don't know. There's something against Mrs. Puff, but I'm really not sure about this part. Like this whole thing with the warden.
Mrs. Puff actually likes being in prison.
One day down.
Yeah, this is funny.
2,528
As long as
to
she's
go.
away from SpongeBob.
That's just shy of 4 years without SpongeBob. I'm going to enjoy this.
So, he comes up with a new plan. Keep Mrs. Puff secret and let her out of prison early, but only under the condition that she has to teach SpongeBob. He's literally turning her normal life into a
Picture
prison.
again.
And he makes sure going back to prison to avoid SpongeBob isn't even an option for her anymore, because he'll make sure that SpongeBob is always in there with her. And he's not gonna let her escape and start a new life like she did in New Kelp City. He makes sure to give her an ankle bracelet that doesn't let her leave Bikini Bottom.
I can't even leave town without violating my parole.
He is the mastermind who's been controlling everything this entire time.
Alright, gonna interrupt here. The warden that told Mrs. Puff she could leave prison if she gave free driving lessons was actually referred to as a female.
And besides,
Oh, really?
the warden says she'll let you go early if you do her a favor.
Oh,
So-
okay, there you go. Dang, that's a big contradiction. I didn't realize I missed that.
That's my bad. That definitely wasn't the same warden. It doesn't
Yeah.
ruin my theory, but like I said,
I don't
I've
know.
got some new ideas for this part that I'll talk about later.
But guess what?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that part too, because like this whole warden thing, I'm not really sold on. I guess not completely, but there could be something where some maybe the jail or the prison there. There's something against Mrs. Puff there, something against her.
His insidious plan doesn't even end there. This is not the first time we've seen the warden character. We first see him in
Yeah.
season 4, episode 2, Crabs vs. Plankton. In
That's
this
where I
episode,
remembered him
Plankton
from.
slips on some water in the Krusty Krab and decides to sue Mr. Krabs for everything he owns. And then guess who shows up out of nowhere and offers to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer?
What I really need is a good lawyer.
Whoa, did
There
somebody
he
say
is.
lawyer? Richard A. Bottomfeeder, attorney at law. I couldn't help but notice that despicable display.
Richard A.
Yeah, so this guy, I feel the same way, just with that one director guy. That one old director fish that was also seen in New Kelp City. I just feel like it's still like a generic character in a way, even though I would say they have been more on the important side when it comes to like their roles than other generic fishes. But I feel like with him, they just want to reuse it. Like even the personalities were a bit different. Like I know coming up, he said that he's like faking this, I think. But I don't know if it's really the same person. I think it's different. Like just the creators just want to reuse some assets for a generic fish that looks important.
Bottom feeder. The warden of the Bikini Bottom prison is also apparently a lawyer? That's kind
Yeah.
of strange. Those both sound like major careers. You usually wouldn't imagine someone being both. Then he says he'll be Mr. Krabs' lawyer completely free of charge.
So,
Like I know I'm not really supposed to think much about like the creators' inputs and more of like just the in universe stuff. But yeah, for me, it's just hard to think about like just them being the same. I do think they just want to reuse like characters that look important because they have a more important role for these type of episodes.
how much is this gonna cost me?
Actually, I won't charge a dime unless we win.
Well, that's awfully generous of you, Richard. Alright, a lot of people pointed out that this is actually something lawyers sometimes do, but
Oh,
when you add it
really?
up with everything else, it's still kinda suspiciously convenient. That's the point I'm trying to make here. He seems very confident that he can win the case, but right before he goes to court, he slips on some water and says SpongeBob will have to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer now.
Oh, this is gonna be a slam dunk.
Oh no! Mr. Krabs' lawyer, speak to me!
Wrapped with pain, can't move.
Looks like you're gonna have to handle this one, son.
He tells SpongeBob that he has to represent Mr. Krabs, even though he himself called SpongeBob a liability.
Actually, SpongeBob, we won't be needing any testimony from you. Why, you'd be more of a
liability.
liability than an asset.
But it's okay, because apparently all SpongeBob needs to win is inside of Richard's briefcase.
Everything you need to win is in this here case.
Really? Everything?
Except when SpongeBob gets to court, he realizes that Richard never gave him the combination to the case.
It's, all in here.
Really?
Yep.
Yeah, it's
right
been a setup.
in here.
You can't open it.
Problem?
Your lawyer didn't give me the combination.
Either Richard A. Bottomfeeder is the worst lawyer in history, or this is all part of his elaborate plan to ruin Mrs. Puff's life. Here's what I think happened. First, he finds out that Mr. Krabs is being sued, and he wants to ensure that Mr. Krabs loses the case because he wants to destroy any chance Mrs. Puff has at finding love. So he pretends to be a lawyer, even offering his services for free, something Mr. Krabs can't resist. He makes Mr. Krabs
Yeah, he
feel
does love
confident that
love
they're
free
gonna win the
stuff.
case, and then at the last second, he pretends to get into an accident so he
I remember the
can't
free
represent Mr.
parking
Krabs.
space he was
Instead of
enjoying.
finding a real lawyer to replace him, he tells the most incompetent person for the job, SpongeBob, that he has to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer. And he gives him a case that allegedly has all the answers in it without actually giving SpongeBob the combination, setting him up for a total failure in court.
There was a Krabby Patty inside Richard's case that SpongeBob later used to win, but I don't think that was part of his plan. We see Richard and Mr. Krabs previously discussing their plan to beat Plankton, and Mr. Krabs is later surprised by the Krabby Patty and believes it was just Richard's lunch. If using the Krabby Patty to win was the plan all along, Mr. Krabs would have known. Yeah, I agree with that.
Richard A. Bottomfeeder refuses to let anyone get close to Mrs. Puff, not Dorsal Dan, and not Mr. Krabs. This guy has squillion levels of hate for Mrs. Puff. But why? What exactly did her previous student do that warrants this much torture? It can't be something as simple as him or his property getting damaged. It has to be something life-changing, something like losing a loved one because of the student's reckless driving. And I think the show gives us one last hint about who this might have been. All the pictures of Mrs. Puff's house are very meaningful to her. She's got photos of Mr. Krabs, her pet snail, and of course those infinitely looping photos that told us so much about her mental state. But there is one more photo in this house that might be the key to this entire conspiracy. In season 12,
I remember
episode
this part
14,
of
Plankton's
the
old
theory.
chum, we see a photo of someone we've never seen before on Mrs. Puff's wall. There's some surprising similarities between this character and Richard. The green color,
I mean, there are
the red bow
similarities.
tie, the overall fancy, serious appearance. It clearly isn't the same person, but maybe this is someone related to Richard, like a father, a son, or a brother that Mrs. Puff's former student killed. And the reason she keeps a photo of him up is to have a permanent reminder to never make the same mistake of giving someone a license who doesn't deserve it.
I don't know, it feels
Mrs.
like a
Puff
stretch.
is a boarding school teacher who once made a terrible mistake that led to the loss of her business.
It does feel like a stretch.
identity,
I'm not sure if I
sanity,
fully
and
believe
any
that,
chance at
you know, this whole
finding
wooden
happiness.
part.
I like to think that there used to be a time when she was happy, back when her husband was still alive. If only he was still around today, maybe she wouldn't have to face all of this on her own. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Is what I would say if I was done, except her husband is still alive.
Wait, what?
In the SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob and Patrick travel to a gift shop named Shell City that's full of dead fish turned into knickknacks and ornaments. Except they end up setting
Dude,
off
I
a
love this
smoke
movie, man.
detector, which activates
One of my
the sprinkler
favorites.
system and brings all
Another
the
woman.
dead fish back to life, including a very familiar-looking pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Puff is alive. Well, wait a second. If he's
There he
alive
is.
and he escaped, then why hasn't he gone back to Mrs. Puff? Why is she still alone? Because remember, she ran away from their home in New Kelp City and started a new identity. So sadly, Mr. Puff has no way of finding her. The tragedy of Mrs. Puff's story is that her happiness is just a city away, but she can never even leave town because that would violate her parole. Richard A. Bottomfeeder probably
Yeah,
even
I can
knows
see
her
that.
husband is alive and is making sure they're never reunited. As the name says, Richard really is a bottom feeder.
Incredibly excited because we get to
Ooh.
talk to
Official audio. Audio from the official Nickelodeon SpongeBob podcast. I didn't even know they had a SpongeBob podcast. I'm guessing coming up here is going to be the ranking and then the part two mini theory. But yeah, that was the Mrs. Puff theory. Like I really love everything about it except for the whole like part three mastermind warden stuff. Like for me, I'm just not really on board with it just because I don't feel like the evidence presented was, you know, that connected. Like especially when just saying like this character's the same one as the other one, or like saying this character's similar to the other one. I feel like I need to see more evidence that maybe is consistent with that. But that part's the only one that I'm not really into. I do think everything else though is so good. Like it's really, really good. But yeah, let's go see this one. This one I haven't heard about yet. Because yeah, at the end over there, when he said thanks for watching, that's when the whole don't feed the muse stuff starts. Like that's when the very first scene of it begins at. But now we don't have that anymore. Like it's not included. So instead we get some new stuff. So here we go.
To the voice of Karen today, Jill Talley.
I love trying to make sense out of SpongeBob. My
The normal voice.
adorable nephew called me up and he just was like, "Hey, Jill, do you know about this? What do you make of this? Like, what do you think about this Mrs. Puff?" And I didn't know what he was talking about. It was like a fever dream because I wasn't aware of all the conspiracy stuff. So all I'm hearing on the phone is criminal past clues. And I'm like, what is he talking about? I said, I'm going to look into it, Frankie. So
That kid is
I went
based.
online and I started looking at it and it was fascinating. I was in. I was going, I want to know too.
I'm guessing they're acknowledging Alex Bale or maybe someone else. The thing is, I think Alex Bale's theory, like, yeah, I'm sure there's been other Mrs. Puff theories before, but like, I feel like because of the amount of views that video got, like, what, 20 million? I'm sure that she went to his video first, you know? It's also probably just like the best way to understand Mrs. Puff's past compared to like maybe reading it on a forum or something. I think it held up pretty well. I would say for the most part.
So, the Mrs. Puff theory. I guess maybe a few people might have watched this one. Yeah, so this is the one that
This is the theory where I officially began the Muse ARG. Yeah, this is where he at the end. That's when he started doing that whole beginning of it. By this point, I had planned the whole getting trapped as the SpongeBob guy arc and had a rough idea of where I wanted to go with the story. Luckily, the theories continued to get views, but if they suddenly stopped, I planned on incorporating that into the story somehow.
really took off, and for good reason. It's
Yeah.
really the one theory where the creators just straight up unambiguously hand us the lore.
No, yeah, I think with Mrs. Puff, I think that's the most obvious theory that you can make about the show. Just because she gives so many clues, like places to start at. You know, her saying like not again, and just using the word again like multiple times. Like, yeah, there's definitely something more to her.
As
And
opposed
like I remember some yeah, I guess in some of the later SpongeBob episodes, like she even showcased more of her, I guess her burglary, yeah, her like robber skills. I forgot when. I think it was with the Gal Pals, like those episodes. I kind of forgot.
opposed to the usual vague details and Easter eggs that may or may not be hinting at something. But how does it hold up now? Well, you might be surprised to hear that I'd probably only put it in 4th place.
Oh,
I think the first two
I thought maybe it might be in second or third, but fourth. Hmm.
thirds are really strong, and it could have been one of my best theories, but then I kind of go on this weird tangent in the third part with this random
Yeah.
background warden character
Yeah.
with a bunch of assumptions and a kind of weak final connection to this vaguely similar picture.
Wow.
I think I just
So yeah, he acknowledges that too. I thought maybe it would just be me, you know, that doesn't feel like that part was strong. But no, he also thought it wasn't that strong too. I thought everything else before, like the first two parts, were good. Um, but yeah, with that warden stuff, I'm not really sure about that. It did feel like he was trying to like stretch it out, make connections when there really didn't feel like there was a connection at all.
really wanted to give this theory more of a sense of closure and a final big twist, but that ultimately made it feel
Dang.
kind of forced in the end.
No, yeah, it did. But I felt like it was still like good though. Like everything before, Like even with that alone, like if oh my VTuber model, even with that alone, like I feel like that would be second or third, maybe at least third. But fourth is still understandable, I would say. Oh no, I zoomed out again.
But I have since ended up coming up with so many new ideas and discoveries for this theory that I decided to just make the next mini theory just a straight up Mrs. Puff Part 2. So if we pretend like this new stuff was always part of the theory, I think I'll bump it up to second place where it rightfully belongs. So without further ado...
Oh shoot, is that good? Oh my gosh, I can't wait to see this. Okay.
Here is the Mrs. Puff theory Part 2.
Because I don't feel like he needs to add any more. Like anything else, I feel like it's just is gonna support his theory. I'm not sure about the warden part.
So, there's been a lot of new evidence that's come out about Mrs. Puff since I posted my theory. Some I already added to the main theory, like her real name being discovered, so go watch that if you haven't already. But I saved some really cool discoveries and new ideas just for this mini theory. Like, in Lighthouse Louie, I missed this the first time, but if you look closely in her pile of junk, you can actually see a dead police officer's corpse.
It looks like a cutout, though. I think that's just a cutout.
Actually, no, this is just an obstacle from her training course.
Wow.
But I bet you didn't know.
Another Easter egg.
Coral, we see her dispose of the real Mrs. Puff's dead body.
What?
Also, no, this is just a pinata that looks like her. Okay, but
I never watched. I never really watched that much.
Before
the
I
Camp
get
Coral
into the
stuff.
actual new discoveries,
only like a few
I want
episodes.
to talk about some alternative ideas I've come up with for some parts of the Mrs. Puff theory. As I've already said, I am not the biggest fan of where I took the third part of this theory. I really wanted there to be this big reveal about why the prison is forcing Mrs. Puff to teach SpongeBob, when in reality it just makes so much more sense that, like in Doing Time, every time Mrs. Puff sees SpongeBob in jail, she's actually just hallucinating.
Good day, class!
I must be having a nightmare!
You know, there's just way more direct evidence in the show to support this, as opposed to this convoluted warden theory. And it's further supported by my new imagination mini theory.
Yeah, that one holds up well now.
We know the show exists in a world where things you imagine can easily come to life.
It's not just a cartoon.
Puff is constantly imagining her fear of SpongeBob or the guilt from her past mistakes. So
that's what I thought.
It makes sense that she would get trapped in her own delusions so often. But there's always been this big loose end in my theory that I've always wanted to find a way to wrap up.
What is that?
We know Mrs. Puff prematurely gave a license to one of her previous students in New Kelp City, and that led to the city being destroyed.
Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor.
But who was Mrs. Puff's original student before SpongeBob? And while we haven't gotten any new evidence about this, I think I've got two strong candidates for who it could be.
Oh my god.
One of the best comments I got.
Wait. SpongeBob's cousin? Is that what I saw? Yeah, his cousin Stanley. That could be him. Because, dude, Stanley's like, I guess a worse for SpongeBob. Wow, that could be him. That's interesting to think about. And also the other one that he showed here, I think that was the one in the prison, right?
From the Mrs. Puff video.
I mean, I guess that makes sense because that whole episode was her imagining the whole thing.
Was the idea that the original student was actually SpongeBob's cousin, Stanley S. Squarepants.
Hi, Squidward. I'd like you to meet
There's
my
two of
cousin
them.
Stanley. We're related.
There's 2 of them?
Stanley is a character we meet for only one episode in Season 5. He's SpongeBob's cousin from out of town, and he's extremely accident-prone, even more than SpongeBob.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know what town he's from, but we know his Uncle Sherm sent him away because he was too destructive. So he totally fits the idea of Mrs. Puff's former student that probably destroyed New Kelp City. It would also add another layer to why Mrs. Puff is so tortured by SpongeBob specifically. He would literally look and act exactly like her former student.
Yeah.
There's 2 of them?
So yeah, I think this is totally plausible. Great comment. The only thing that kind of holds this theory back is the lack of any actual concrete connection between Stanley and Mrs. Puff. Like, unfortunately, they're never in the same episode. But I think I have another possible candidate for this mystery student. Someone who we actually see interact with Mrs. Puff. in the Mrs. Puff
Yeah.
theory, I theorized that the entire
There's that
episode
one
doing
girl.
time was all imagined by Mrs. Puff, and everything we see, even small details like her changing prison uniforms, are symbolic for what's really going on inside of her head. But if that's true, then what does this random other prisoner that keeps showing up symbolize?
Hey there, Puff Mama. What's today's grub?
Hi, Donna.
Yeah.
It's chilly.
I wouldn't have thought much about it if it wasn't for this very interesting moment where she returns at the end of the episode.
Oh. Wow. So with that part, you think that's probably, I don't know, it's so weird. Cause like just the way they talk in the cafeteria looked normal, like they'd have no problems. But then at the end there, like I can see him say that that's actually like the moment that, yeah, like this here is like proof that this was the previous student. I don't know. Let's see what he has to say about this.
Oh, it's just my
Yeah, she's right there.
imagination again.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
I think this could be implying that Donna is Mrs. Puff's original student. We see her driving Mrs. Puff's boat in a free fall crash, just like her old student probably also did. And then she literally gets replaced by SpongeBob.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
Yeah. The thing that's just weird is that I just feel like if she saw her in the cafeteria that she would react more negatively. But I just feel like, at that moment she's just, like she's just scared of everything. Just being in the situation.
Ah, forget it.
Just like how he actually replaced her original student. So yeah, I think both Donna and Stanley are pretty good candidates for the original student.
Oh.
Stanley is a bit more thematically
Is there one
fitting,
more?
but Donna actually
It's just the way it's
has
being
some
presented
direct
right now.
evidence in the show. So yeah, I could see it being either of them, but that's all just tying up loose ends. The real reason I decided to cover Mrs. Puff again in this mini theory
Oh,
is
okay.
because of two major new developments in recent SpongeBob episodes.
Yeah, I thought maybe he would maybe choose one at least. I guess he's just saying that it can go either way. I can see go either way. Yeah, I guess what he said is also, understandable where with Stanley, we never seen him together with Mrs. Puff and Stanley. So yeah, it's really hard to make that connection.
The first
I mean, in my opinion, I feel like it's Stanley. Like if I had to choose one. But of course, like I said, just there's not really nothing else you can go off other than, he just looks like SpongeBob. And so yeah, SpongeBob reminds her of Stanley. That's really pretty much it.
is in the season 13 episode Arbor Day Disarray. In this episode, Sandy gives everyone trees she grew, and we get this scene between Mrs. Puff and her tree.
I love talking to someone who knows how to keep a secret.
Oh, I think I saw this one a
Finally
bit.
tell someone what really happened when I pulled that job in Shell
Whoa.
What really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City?
I kinda missed
They're
that part.
Still adding more mysteries to solve about Mrs. Puff. It sounds like
By the way,
Mrs. Puff
Shell City. That's the one in the movie. Shell City. And then, Patrick was like saying it. Shell City. That's the place, right?
did some kind of heist or maybe has some
Actually, no, I do remember
connection.
this scene and her saying that. I thought at first she said something else from my memory, but no, I think she did say that. I remember commenting about it when I saw it. Wow.
To Shell City from the SpongeBob movie. And if you remember, I theorized that Shell City was the place Mr. Puff, her former dead husband, was being
Oh,
held.
snap. I didn't really think too much about, Mr. Puff, but dang, that's a good connection. I think that reinforces that is him.
They end up setting off the smoke detector, which activates the sprinkler system and brings all the dead fish back to life, including a very familiar looking pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Puff is alive.
And I know with those two like real life pufferfish models, Like I know like when it comes to the cartoons, I'm always like kind of picky on if they look the same or not. But I do feel like real life though, it like I imagine maybe they can't find the same one. They have to remake it maybe. Maybe for like original stuff for the movie. I don't know. I guess it's just harder to like mimic the real one versus the cartoon one. So I guess for me that's kind of like a pass.
So, is it possible this job is somehow
Dang.
related to Mr. Puff?
I can see
Well,
that.
before we get into that,
Like I can see Mrs. Puff like maybe ditching the husband in the city. Just like and that's how like he ended up here.
there is one more new development we need to talk about. In the season 14 episode, Hysterical History, for the very first time ever, we actually do get to definitively see Mr. Puff when
What?
he was alive.
Bikini
Is that really Mr. Puff? I never seen this episode. Wow, that's him?
So, this episode is just a bunch of flashbacks from Bikini Bottom's history, and we learn that Mr. Puff was actually a wealthy businessman who ran a boat factory. And
So that's weird. That's really weird then. It's just with that puffer fish. You would think like going back to a cartoon style that like he would kind of look like that. You know, even with the hair too. But even back then, you know, they're not I feel like especially back then they weren't really focused on consistency and like having like a set character because I know with the recent seasons that you know they've been making more regular characters that feel more consistent. Like they're not going to look any different and stuff. Like, you know, I know they'd like remade Squidward's mom. Like they have a new look to her. And I'm guessing that'll be the look that they'll be keeping from here on out.
Sandy later confirms that
So
this
I'm guessing like this is like a reboot of Mr. Puff. It could be that, or maybe they're just not the same person at all.
is all actually true. This isn't just a story SpongeBob.
Or what if that puffer fish that we saw in Shell City that became alive? What if like what if they like actually had a group of pufferfish and that guy kind of like failed in the plan and he got caught in the he got like caught or something. That could be it. But yeah, I'm just gonna continue here. I'm sure they'll explain everything.
Bob made up. Now, Mr. Puff looks and sounds a lot like Mrs. Puff.
Speed up, line number 5.
And the other flashbacks in this episode seem to be about ancestors of our main characters, so maybe this is actually supposed to be just a relative of Mrs. Puff, not her dead husband. But
Okay.
remember, Mrs. Puff is not originally from Bikini Bottom, and we know her last name isn't really Puff, it's Blowfish. So
What if she just assumes like she took someone else's identity or ancestry? Oh.
this is most likely her former husband, Mr. Puff, before he died.
Or that could be
And
it.
Unfortunately, this does seem to disprove my Mr. Puff theory because
Yeah.
he clearly looks very different
They look
than
very
the
different.
pufferfish we see in Shell City. But even if this pufferfish wasn't Mr. Puff, I don't think I was wrong about Mr. Puff being at Shell City. The fact that he's shown as a dried up, hanging pufferfish with googly eyes is way too similar to be a coincidence.
I don't know.
And
The thing is with the one over here on the left, like the spikes or the spines were a lot longer. This one looks like I mean maybe it was already been like blown out. I don't know. They just look kind of different for me.
and then there's the fact that they just
But like, you know, like I said, because it's real life, I imagine that maybe they can't replicate it like very easily compared to like drawings, like cartoon drawings.
confirmed Mrs. Puff has some sort of history with Shell City specifically. I think Mr. Puff was abducted and taken to Shell City, but the reason why we don't see him in the SpongeBob movie is probably because he was already sold to someone else by that point, meaning he
Oh.
was unfortunately never saved by SpongeBob. So
Wow.
that leaves us with one final question. What was the job Mrs. Puff pulled at Shell City, and what does it have to do with her husband's death?
Yeah, I do think it's just maybe a heist that went wrong and that she left him behind.
Well, my first guess is that this job was some sort of rescue mission to save Mr. Puff from Shell City and she failed. But listen to how she talks about it.
I can finally.
Or yeah, I forgot about that line. Like maybe maybe she kind of like backstab on purpose. Like she meant to, I guess, fail on that job and like put Mr. Puff or whatever pufferfish that is there into trouble.
What really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City?
Whatever happened at Shell City, she's happy about it. In fact, it's
Yeah.
kind of a sinister, nefarious happiness.
What really happened when I pulled that job?
She's not devastated that her husband was lost forever, she's happy about it. I never really considered this before, but could Mrs. Puff actually be responsible for her husband's death?
Yeah.
Did Mrs. Puff kill her husband? I mean, we know Plankton sold Neptune's crown to Shell City.
I just wanted to say thanks again for selling me the crown. I sold it to a guy in Shell City.
So it does seem possible to arrange for this kind of thing to happen. And Arbor Day Disarray ends with Mrs. Puff's tree ratting her out to
What the heck?
police.
Hello, police department? I got a lead on that Shell City job.
I don't remember this part. But you know, I was just having it on in the background when I watched it.
Why
Like it was just
would the
background
Bikini
stuff.
Bottom police care about something she did at a human gift shop? I mean, they didn't care when SpongeBob stole from there. The only explanation is that she wasn't stealing from humans, she was giving them something or someone from Bikini Bottom. Mr. Puff. Mrs. Puff arranged for fishermen to kidnap and kill her husband.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
what really
So much better than the
happened at
warden
Shell
theory.
City. But why? Well, other than Mr. Puff kind of seeming like a jerk who mistreats his employees, he's also very wealthy, which means that when he died, in a way that can't be traced back to Mrs. Puff, as his wife, she would inherit his money. Which
Yeah.
explains how Mrs. Puff, who previously had to abandon her entire life and start over from scratch in Bikini Bottom, could afford to open a massive boating school. Maybe this was her plan
Yeah.
all along. Get
Wow.
close to some rich jerk, marry him, and then have him killed to inherit his money.
Dang.
These little breadcrumbs they've given us have told us so much
This
more
is very
about
mind-blowing.
Mrs. Puff's past. But also, maybe, just maybe, her future as well. Mr. Puff was portrayed as a greedy, unethical capitalist who only cared about money, even at the expense of his employees. And does that remind you of anyone else in
Mr.
Mrs.
Krabs?
Puff's life?
Oh no. Dude, Mr. Krabs is next. She's gonna kill Mr. Krabs. And take his money. She's gonna be Mrs. Krabs. Trade Mr. Krabs in Shell City again. Dang, dude.
Unhand that penny or the arm comes off. Keep on trucking, SpongeBob.
How could you trade SpongeBob for 62 cents?
You think I could have gotten more?
If she did it to Mr. Puff, who's to say she's not planning to do it again to Mr. Krabs? Maybe this is the entire reason why she's dating him. Let's just hope Mr. Krabs isn't planning on getting married.
Oh my
anytime soon.
gosh, dude.
The imaginary doppelganger Mr. Krabs,
Oh, yeah, right.
that is. And that is the Mrs. Puff theory, part 2.
Dang. I think this is his best. Yeah, I think this is his best mini theory so far. I think, yeah, if you include this as part of the main theory, then yeah, I can understand him putting this in second place. Wow, this one was really good. Like so much better than the skeleton and the imagination. Like dang, dude. Yeah, I'm very, very impressed. But yeah, guys, I think that's pretty much it. Next time will be the evolution theory and the human war mini theory. Interesting, because I know in this there is war, but not with the humans. This sounds like an extension, just like with this one here. It sounds like an extension to like this theory here. But yeah, I can't wait for this one. I think this one was also pretty good too. But yeah, as we go farther into the theories here, I feel like I'm like forgetting a lot of the contents within it, just because I feel like for me, the television and Mrs. Puff theory has been the most memorable one for me. But I do think I still remember parts of the evolution theory. I think this one is also pretty good too. But yeah, as we go on, I do think I don't remember much about them. But yeah, we'll see what they're like. Anyway, guys, yeah, that was it for this video for the Mrs. Puff theory and the part 2 of it. Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. Like I said, the warden stuff, I wasn't really a big fan of, and apparently he agrees. I thought maybe he would expand upon it, because I thought maybe he would like correct it, like maybe he would, make more sense of it. But no, he just said it's, you know, he wasn't really that good, which, yeah, that was like interesting to see. But yeah, I like the part 2 mini theory and the main theory here. Next time will be these two over here. So yeah, guys, go check out his channel, by the way. Make sure you go give this video a watch and stuff. But yeah, it's a very good compilation so far. I really love it. All the new stuff as well that he's correcting and adding in. But yeah, I've been liking it. So yeah, that'll be for now, guys. That's game.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good